The encounter. It was one of those early flights when most people just wanted to settle in, grab a drink, and drift off to sleep. The hum of the airplane's engines and the low murmur of voices filled the cabin as passengers stowed their bags, adjusted seatbacks, and prepared for takeoff. As I found my way to my seat in row 13, I was squeezed between a teenager who seemed lost in his phone and an elderly woman knitting quietly, a soft click of her needles punctuating the otherwise quiet air. The flight was routine at first, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd had my share of cramped, early morning flights and knew what to expect. But then, as I scanned the cabin, I saw him. He was tall, a man with a quiet air of authority. His suit was impeccably tailored, navy blue with a subtle sheen that spoke of luxury without being flashy. The sharp cut of his jacket and the polish on his shoes left no doubt. This was a man who valued quality, who had places to be, and knew how to get there. His dark skin contrasted against the pristine fabric of his suit, and his well-groomed beard gave him an aura of sophistication. He sat by the window, his back straight, but there was something in his eyes. Tiredness, as though he had been on the road for too long. He wasn't like the usual passengers I'd seen that morning. I couldn't help but notice the aura that surrounded him, a quiet confidence mixed with the weight of someone who had seen a lot, been through a lot, and carried it all with grace. His demeanor was calm, almost serene, but there was something else about him. An energy, a presence. I couldn't place it at the time, but it felt like there was more to this man than met the eye. The first sign of trouble came when Emily, the flight attendant, approached him. Emily had been doing her rounds, smiling and engaging with the passengers as she always did. She was in her early 30s, and from the way she carried herself, it was clear she was an experienced flight attendant. But the moment she got close to him, I saw something change. Her smile faltered, just for a second, before she said in a voice that was a little too sharp, "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat." The man looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. He glanced at her, then down at his boarding pass. "I'm aware. This is my seat," he replied, his tone smooth, calm, unruffled. But Emily wasn't convinced. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again, her voice taking on a more insistent edge. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," she said. The request felt unnecessary to me. He'd already shown it once. But she insisted, her expression rigid, almost defensive. The man handed it over without a second thought. She studied the boarding pass for what felt like an eternity, her brow furrowing as her eyes scanned it. After a moment, she looked up, her lips tight with discomfort. "This doesn't seem right," she said, her tone colder now. "Are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Her words lingered in the air, cutting through the quiet buzz of the cabin. I glanced over, my own curiosity piqued. The man's face remained calm, his posture still perfect, his eyes unwavering. "Yes," he said simply, his voice even, betraying none of the frustration that I could tell was building in Emily. "That's my seat. Is there a problem?" His question was direct, his gaze locked on her, but his voice remained courteous, almost detached. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't challenging her, but there was an underlying edge that made it clear he wasn't one to be easily intimidated. Emily stiffened. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes darting back to the boarding pass in her hands. It was as if she was searching for something that would justify her growing discomfort, something that would allow her to correct him, to regain control of the situation. "Well," she started, trying to regain her composure, "it's just that we don't usually see passengers like you in this section." Her voice was laced with an unintended hint of condescension. It wasn't just that she doubted the legitimacy of his boarding pass, but that her words conveyed a deeper, more subtle prejudice. I could see the flicker in the man's eyes, the moment when his calm demeanor almost slipped. But he quickly regained control. "I assure you, my seat is here," he said, his tone now tinged with just the faintest hint of irritation. "You can check with the gate agents if you'd like." Emily's discomfort was palpable, But she didn't relent. She glanced at him one more time, her gaze sweeping over his impeccably groomed appearance, and something in her face changed. It was subtle, but I could see it. A momentary flash of judgment, of assumptions that had been made based on his appearance alone. She didn't believe him. She didn't want to believe him. At that moment, I felt a strange shift in the air. Emily was no longer the confident, professional flight attendant I had seen just minutes before. Now she was visibly rattled, as though the situation had taken a turn that she couldn't quite navigate. And all of this was happening while the man remained composed, almost as if he was waiting for her to catch up, to figure out that she had misjudged him. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Emily back down, or would she continue to press him? I held my breath as the tension in the cabin thickened. The revelation. The cabin was quiet now, the usual hum of pre-flight chatter replaced by an uneasy stillness. Emily, standing just a few feet away, was still holding the man's boarding pass in her hands, her knuckles white from the tight grip. I could see the way her eyes flicked from the pass to the man, as though trying to find some inconsistency, some reason to argue with him. But he didn't seem to be budging. I watched as Emily hesitated for another long moment, her gaze momentarily darting around the cabin, perhaps looking for backup. But none came. Passengers were still settling in, some adjusting their seats, others rummaging through their carry-ons, oblivious to the brewing tension. The man didn't flinch. He just sat there, his eyes soft yet unwavering, his presence almost magnetic. Despite the oddity of the situation, he exuded a calm that I couldn't quite place, as though he was used to handling uncomfortable situations. Emily was beginning to realize that she had backed herself into a corner, and the weight of the moment seemed to dawn on her. "I'm sorry, sir," she finally said, her voice a little less sharp now, though still laced with hesitation. "I've just never seen someone like you in this section. Could you please wait while I check with the gate agent?" The man nodded, not looking offended but merely acknowledging her request. "Of course," he said, his voice low and smooth. He wasn't angry, but there was a certain dignity in the way he responded, a quiet confidence that suggested he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Emily turned away, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way to the front of the plane. I couldn't help but notice that she was walking faster than usual, her shoulders tight with discomfort. It was clear she wasn't just dealing with a mistake. Something deeper was at play here. As Emily approached the cockpit to speak with the gate agent, I caught the briefest glimpse of the man's face. His expression had changed slightly. His jaw was clenched, and I could see the faintest trace of a smile that seemed almost rueful, as though he knew exactly what was happening. It was then that I realized how out of place Emily's behavior was. This wasn't just about a seating mix-up. There was something about the man that seemed to make Emily uneasy, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her discomfort was not just about the confusion over his seat. It was something else, something personal, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice on his behalf. A few minutes later, Emily returned, her expression even more tense than before. She was clutching her tablet, which I assumed was linked to the airline's internal system. "I'm terribly sorry about the confusion," she said, but her tone lacked the sincerity I had expected. "There was a mix-up with your seat assignment. It seems that we overbooked this flight, and there was an error in our system. Unfortunately, this seat should have been assigned to someone else. You'll have to move." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. It was clear now that she was not just trying to correct a mistake. She was trying to get him out of the premium section. The decision had already been made in her mind. He wasn't supposed to be there, not because of a technical error, but because she felt he didn't belong. The man took a moment, his calm demeanor not faltering as he looked at her. "And where do you suggest I sit then?" he asked, his voice neutral but with an edge of quiet authority. He wasn't upset, but there was a hint of challenge in his words now. He had given her the opportunity to fix the situation with grace. But Emily had dug in her heels. Emily hesitated, glancing at the tablet in her hands before looking back at him. "I found a seat for you in the economy section," she said, the words sounding too rehearsed, almost as though she had planned this outcome from the beginning. "It's not ideal, but it's all we have available." She handed him a boarding pass for a seat at the back of the plane. I watched in disbelief as the man took the new boarding pass. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible sign of the frustration I would have expected from anyone else in his position. He simply nodded, as though acknowledging the inevitability of the situation. But just as he started to rise, something changed. He paused, looked at Emily one last time, and then said something that made her freeze in her tracks. "I think you should check again," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I think you'll find I'm in the right seat after all." For a moment, Emily didn't respond. The cabin had fallen completely silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. No one dared to move or speak, all of us caught up in the drama unfolding before us. It was as though the very air had been sucked out of the cabin, leaving only the palpable anticipation of what would happen next. Emily blinked, clearly taken aback. "I don't understand," she stammered, her uncertainty now apparent. "I just check it." "Check again," he repeated, this time his voice colder, more assured. There was something in his eyes now, something that was no longer just calm but commanding. Without saying another word, Emily turned and left once again, this time with a greater sense of urgency. As she made her way toward the front, the man remained in his seat, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze turning toward the window, as though the interaction had already been put behind him. I couldn't help but wonder, who was this man? What was he doing on this flight? And why had Emily felt so threatened by his mere presence? I wasn't the only one wondering. Other passengers were starting to take notice, their conversations dropping off as they watched the drama unfold. Some exchanged uncertain glances, while others simply stared at the man, as if hoping for a clue as to who he really was. I could sense that Emily's discomfort was spreading throughout the cabin. It was as though the moment had escalated beyond a simple seat assignment issue into something much more personal. But it wasn't until she returned a second time, her face pale, and her steps hurried, that the truth finally came to light. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice faltering as she spoke his name. I am so sorry. I didn't realize." Her words trailed off as her face flushed red with embarrassment. For the first time, her gaze dropped to the floor, and I could hear the tremor in her voice. I didn't know who you were." The man didn't respond right away. He just sat there, quietly waiting, the hint of a smile playing at the edges of his lips. "I'll arrange for you to stay in your original seat, of course," Emily stammered, now completely undone. "And I'll make sure you're taken care of for the rest of the flight." It was only then that I understood. The man wasn't just any passenger. He was Mr. Marcus Williams, the owner of the airline, and Emily had just tried to eject him from the first-class section. The shift, the realization hit like a thunderclap. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Emily's face was as red as a beacon, and every passenger in the vicinity seemed to notice the change. There were gasps, whispers, and murmurs as the revelation sank in. This was no ordinary passenger, no random businessman in a fancy suit. Marcus Williams was the owner of the airline, the very airline that had failed to recognize him. And worse yet, tried to remove him from a seat that was rightfully his. I sat back in my chair, stunned by the sudden turn of events. My earlier suspicions about the man's calm demeanor had been correct. He wasn't just some businessman. There was something more to him, something that commanded respect without a word. And now, in the wake of Emily's embarrassment, he remained perfectly poised, not a hint of anger or frustration on his face. Emily, on the other hand, was clearly struggling to regain control. She fumbled with her tablet, her fingers tapping nervously as she tried to reset the seating arrangement. But the weight of the situation seemed to have drained her ability to think clearly. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a fragile insecurity that was as visible as the plane's seatbelt signs. I'm so sorry, Mr. Williams," she stammered again, her voice no longer carrying the authoritative tone of a flight attendant. It was almost as if she was pleading with him now. "I didn't realize." "There's no need for apologies," Marcus said smoothly, his voice still calm and unwavering. "Mistakes happen, but it's important to recognize them when they do and fix them promptly." I watched as Emily's discomfort deepened. Her face was flushed, but now there was a sense of dread in her eyes. It was as though she knew she couldn't undo what had happened. No apology could fix the fact that she had just tried to eject the airline's owner from a premium seat, an error that had been driven not by any technical mistake, but by a deep-seated bias, an assumption that Marcus didn't belong in that section. As Emily stood there, fumbling with her words, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a subtle shift in how the other passengers were reacting. The man sitting across from me, who had been asleep just moments ago, now leaned forward in his seat, observing the interaction with interest. A few others subtly turned their heads, eyes glancing from Marcus to Emily, and back to Marcus. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It had become a spectacle. Marcus had become the focal point of the entire cabin, but he remained unruffled, entirely composed. He simply watched Emily's frantic attempts to recover from her blunder, his expression unreadable. It was clear to me now that he was used to moments like this. The way he carried himself, the quiet strength that emanated from him, suggested that this wasn't the first time he had dealt with someone's assumptions about him based on his appearance or his status. I had a sudden, overwhelming sense that this was more than just about a seating mix-up. Emily's actions, however misguided, were a manifestation of a larger issue, a problem of perception, prejudice, and power dynamics that ran deeper than any single individual or event. It wasn't just about her assuming that someone like Marcus didn't belong in a premium seat. It was about the subtle ways in which people's biases shape their interactions with others, particularly when they don't fully understand the person they're dealing with. And yet, Marcus was doing something remarkable. He wasn't playing into the drama. He wasn't raising his voice or demanding anything. Instead, he was simply being present, calm, and dignified. It was as though he had already risen above the situation before it even started, understanding that this moment wasn't a reflection of who he was. It was a reflection of the person who had failed to recognize him. After what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, Emily finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Mr. Williams," she said, her words trailing off as if unsure how to proceed. "I'll make sure to arrange the proper seating for you. You can remain where you are, and I'll personally ensure that you have whatever you need for the rest of the flight." She paused, her eyes avoiding his, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Marcus's response was as measured and calm as it had been before. He didn't need to say much. Instead, he simply gave her a small nod and replied, "That will be fine. I appreciate the effort." The interaction, while polite, had taken on a certain formality. It was as though, in that moment, both of them understood the deeper implications of what had happened. Emily had made a mistake, yes, but it wasn't just a mistake of logistics. It was a mistake of perception, of assuming that the man in the expensive suit didn't belong in first class. It was a mistake of underestimating someone based on superficial impressions. As Emily returned to her duties, clearly still shaken, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what had just occurred. Marcus's calm, measured response had transformed the moment from one of tension to one of reflection, both for Emily and for the passengers around us. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a microcosm of a larger problem, a problem that we all encounter, whether consciously or not, when we make assumptions about others based on their appearance, their background, or their status. The flight continued, but the air in the cabin had changed. There was a newfound respect in the way passengers regarded Marcus. Some, like the elderly woman beside me, had begun to strike up casual conversations with him, treating him with the kind of courtesy and deference that hadn't been present earlier. And yet, there were others who had remained quiet, their discomfort palpable, unsure of how to act after witnessing such a public exchange. In the seat behind me, a young man leaned forward and whispered to his friend, "Did you see that? She tried to kick him out, and he just handled it like it was nothing. Smooth." I smiled inwardly. It was true. Marcus had handled the entire ordeal with an effortless grace that left no room for anyone to doubt his self-assurance. But it wasn't just the way he had dealt with Emily that was remarkable. It was the way he had transformed the situation. In a moment of discomfort, he had shown everyone around him the true meaning of dignity, self-respect, and power. Without raising his voice, without throwing his weight around, Marcus had made a statement. He had quietly, firmly reminded everyone in the cabin that who you are on the inside is what truly matters, not your appearance, not your status, not how others perceive you. As the flight progressed, I couldn't help but think about the lesson that had unfolded right in front of me. A lesson not about status, but about the strength of character. And as I looked at Marcus, who had settled back into his seat with a slight, knowing smile, I knew that this was a man who carried his worth not in the way he looked or the things he owned, but in the way he treated people and carried himself in the face of adversity. I had a feeling that the rest of the flight was going to be far more interesting than I had ever anticipated. Unveiling the layers. The minutes ticked by slowly after the exchange with Emily, but the air on the plane had taken on an entirely new tone. The quiet whispers among the passengers had settled into a hushed murmur, as though they were all collectively processing what had just unfolded. There was an unspoken understanding now, a shared recognition of the awkwardness of the moment and the undeniable weight of what had just transpired. Yet there was also an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The tension had dissolved, replaced by a quiet respect for the man who had, with such grace, handled the entire situation. Marcus sat with his back against the seat, his eyes closed briefly, and I couldn't help but marvel at how composed he was. He seemed completely unfazed by the scene, unaffected by the subtle shifting of eyes around him. It was as if he was living in a world apart, untouchable by the petty discomforts of others. I glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Emily was still trying to regain her composure, her hands clutching her tablet tightly. She was walking with purpose now, but it was clear that she had been rattled, not just by the mistake, but by the realization that she had misjudged a man, someone who was not just any passenger, but the very one who had the power to reshape her entire career with a single word. Her earlier air of confidence had crumbled, and now there was a look of embarrassment, mingled with guilt on her face as she moved down the aisle. As the flight continued on, I found myself glancing back at Marcus every so often, curious about his story. He was the kind of man who commanded attention, not through loud gestures or grand displays, but by simply being himself. It was a quiet authority, an inner strength that radiated outwards. I could sense that there was much more to him than the well-tailored suit and quiet demeanor. There was a depth to him, a kind of silent wisdom that seemed to draw people in, and I found myself wondering what had brought him to this point in his life. The moment the seatbelt sign was turned off and the plane had reached cruising altitude, a soft voice interrupted my thoughts. It was the elderly woman sitting next to me, the one who had been knitting earlier, now putting her work aside. She had been silently observing everything, and I could tell she was intrigued by what had just occurred. "You know," she began softly, "I saw what happened back there. That man, he handled it with such dignity. I can't say I would have done the same. If I were in his shoes, I think I would have been furious." I smiled at her, appreciating the fact that she had observed the situation with such clarity. "He was calm, wasn't he?" I said, glancing toward Marcus once again. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stay so composed in the face of something like that." The woman nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "People like him, people who carry themselves with such quiet confidence, they don't need to raise their voices. They don't need to argue or shout. They understand something that the rest of us sometimes forget. They understand that the way you handle yourself in a situation speaks volumes more than anything you say." Her words struck a chord with me. It was true. Marcus hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to assert his power or demand anything from anyone. His calm, collected nature had been the perfect response to someone who had tried to undermine him. And it wasn't just about the seat. It was about the assumptions that had been made about him based on nothing more than his appearance. The way Emily had treated him, the way she had assumed he didn't belong in the premium section simply because of the color of his skin, was a reflection of the deeper issues that lay beneath the surface. "Do you think she'll be okay?" I asked the woman, still contemplating the aftermath. "I mean, Emily." She looked so embarrassed. The elderly woman glanced over at Emily, who was now at the front of the cabin, speaking with another flight attendant in low tones. "She will be," the woman said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "But she'll remember this. I think it's a lesson that's going to stay with her. She'll learn, eventually, that you can't judge people based on what you see on the outside. You never know who you're really dealing with." I nodded, appreciating the wisdom in her words. Emily's mistake was one that many of us have made at one point or another, the mistake of judging someone based on external appearances, without taking the time to understand the layers beneath the surface. And Marcus, in that moment, had given Emily and the rest of the passengers a valuable lesson in grace and self-respect. As I sat back in my seat, watching the clouds drift by outside the window, I began to realize that this was more than just a flight. It was a moment of awakening. A lesson about perception, about how we see others, and how those perceptions can shape our interactions. Marcus's calm presence had changed everything. His ability to remain unfazed by the disrespect and his quiet strength had altered the course of the entire flight. And it had shifted something in me as well, a recognition of the importance of dignity, the power of self-control, and the profound impact of not letting the actions of others define who you are. Marcus had become more than just the man who owned the airline. He had become a living example of the power of resilience, of the strength that comes from knowing who you are and not allowing anyone's assumptions to change that. I knew that I would carry this lesson with me, and I wondered how many others on this flight were feeling the same way. The hours passed, and soon the flight began its descent. Emily, after her earlier mistake, seemed to take on a new sense of purpose. She made her way down the aisle, offering quiet apologies to the passengers, ensuring that everyone was comfortable. But there was a noticeable difference in her demeanor now. She was walking with a sense of humility, of recognition that her actions had consequences, and that she had the opportunity to learn and grow from this experience. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign illuminated, I stood up and grabbed my bag from the overhead compartment. As I did, I noticed Marcus standing at the front of the plane, his posture still impeccable, his demeanor unchanged. But there was a difference in the way the passengers looked at him now. A new respect, a recognition of who he truly was. He nodded briefly as people exited the plane, acknowledging their presence with quiet grace. It was as though the entire cabin had shifted, the passengers now aware that they had witnessed something important, something transformative. And as I passed by him, I couldn't help but offer a small smile. It wasn't just a smile of recognition. It was a smile of gratitude, of understanding that I had just witnessed something profound. Marcus Williams had not just taught us all a lesson about dignity and composure. He had shown us the power of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, but is felt in every action, in every moment of calm in the face of adversity. In a world that often values loudness over quietude and appearance over substance, Marcus had reminded us that true power lies not in what we show the world, but in how we choose to respond to it. And for that, I was thankful. The unexpected encounter. The final descent of the plane felt slower than usual, as if time itself had stretched out, allowing everyone aboard a moment to reflect. We had all experienced something that was more than just a flight from one place to another. There was a quiet understanding that this journey had left us with something tangible, something beyond the typical flight routine. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac, the low hum of the engines was replaced by the familiar sounds of the cabin preparing for arrival. People began to gather their things, shuffling, adjusting their seatbelts, and mentally transitioning back to reality. But the ripple effect of what had just unfolded still lingered in the air. Marcus remained as poised as ever, sitting still with his hands folded in his lap. His demeanor hadn't shifted at all. He didn't appear to be in any rush to exit the plane, nor did he seem eager to be recognized or fawned over. It was as if the world around him had momentarily stopped, and in his quiet way, he was reminding us that true power doesn't need validation. True authority is earned in silence and grace, not through display. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, I moved toward the aisle, my mind still processing everything that had happened. The elderly woman beside me gave me a knowing smile as she grabbed her knitting bag, a look in her eyes that suggested she too had grasped the deeper meaning of the day. "You know," she said softly, "the world would be a much better place if more people carried themselves like that man." I nodded in agreement, knowing that what she said was true. Marcus had left an indelible impression on us all. His quiet strength had opened a conversation, one that transcended the misunderstanding of a mere seat dispute. It was about human dignity, assumptions, and the power of grace under pressure. As the line of passengers began to shuffle off the plane, I noticed that Marcus was still seated, waiting until the crowd had thinned before standing up himself. There was no rush, no hurry in his movements, just a deliberate sense of calm. The other passengers passed him without incident, offering him polite nods or lingering glances, but no one spoke directly to him. It was as though the cabin had collectively decided to give him space, respecting the silence he radiated. Then, just as I was about to make my way toward the door, I saw a familiar face. It was Emily. She was standing off to the side, her expression downcast and uncertain. She had clearly been through the ringer. Her earlier confidence had been shattered, replaced by the quiet humility of someone who had made a mistake. But there was something else in her eyes too, a realization, a moment of clarity that perhaps she hadn't expected to come from this encounter. I paused for a moment, wondering what she would do next. Emily had handled the situation poorly at first, but there was still something about her that made me think she wasn't beyond redemption. She wasn't malicious, just misguided, and now, it seemed, she was wrestling with the consequences of her actions. Before I could turn away, I noticed Marcus standing up, moving slowly down the aisle. His gaze was steady as he approached Emily, who was standing near the exit, looking as though she was preparing to avoid eye contact with him. She didn't know what to expect from this encounter, but I could tell she was bracing herself for something uncomfortable. Marcus stopped in front of her, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. He wasn't towering over her in any menacing way, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He looked down at her, his face composed, and for a moment, they just stood there in silence. "Emily," he said simply, his voice warm but firm. "It's okay." The words were soft, but they carried weight. I could see the tension in Emily's body slowly begin to fade. Her shoulders relaxed, and she lifted her gaze to meet his, clearly surprised by his calmness, his willingness to let go of the incident without adding further stress. "I never meant to make you uncomfortable," she said, her voice a little shaky. I assumed, and I should have known better. I'm truly sorry." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he replied, the kindness in his voice impossible to miss. "We all make assumptions. It's a human flaw. What matters is how we handle those moments when we realize we're wrong." Emily looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'll learn from this," she said, almost to herself. "I promise." Marcus's response was simple, yet profound. "We all should." Then, after a brief moment of silence, he offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Mistakes are part of life. What defines us is how we choose to move forward from them." With that, Marcus stepped past Emily, continuing on his way toward the door. I watched as she stood there for a moment, processing his words, clearly touched by his grace. She didn't chase after him, didn't offer any more apologies, but there was a shift in the way she carried herself now. She stood taller, her posture straighter, as if the encounter had ignited something within her, a desire to be better, to do better. I left the plane with my thoughts still swirling. The exchange between Marcus and Emily had made me reflect on the complexities of human nature. How often do we judge others based on their outward appearance, their social status, or their race, only to realize later that we were completely wrong? How often do we allow our assumptions to dictate our behavior without understanding the full picture? I had witnessed firsthand how a simple moment of humility and understanding could completely transform a tense situation. Marcus's ability to remain calm, to offer forgiveness and understanding, had been a masterclass in how to handle adversity with grace. Outside the terminal, I walked toward baggage claim, my mind still occupied by the events of the flight. As I made my way through the crowd, I found myself reflecting on how this experience had affected me. It wasn't just about the interaction between Marcus and Emily. It was about how they had both handled their roles in the situation. Emily had been given an opportunity for growth, and Marcus had given her the space to learn from her mistake. He hadn't sought revenge, hadn't tried to assert his power in the moment. Instead, he had shown her the kind of respect and kindness that only a truly powerful person could give. I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope as I left the airport that day. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to human interaction than the assumptions we so often make. That kindness, understanding, and grace were more powerful than any of us realized. And that, in the end, it is our character, our ability to learn and grow, that truly defines who we are. And maybe, just maybe, I had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter for Emily. One where she would take the lessons she had learned and apply them to every interaction she had in the future. And for Marcus, the man who had made it all possible, I knew he would continue to live with quiet strength, knowing that sometimes the most impactful lessons are the ones that are taught through silence, understanding, and the simple act of leading by example. The ripple effect. It had been a few days since the flight, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened during that brief encounter. It wasn't just about the tension between Marcus and Emily, or even the way the passengers had watched in hushed silence. It was about the way that moment had transformed something that could have been awkward or uncomfortable into a lesson that reached far beyond the confines of the airplane. I had thought about the exchange every day since then, pondering the deeper implications of the interaction. It wasn't just about a man quietly asserting his right to be treated with respect. It was about the subtle, powerful reminder that our actions and our reactions define us more than any external markers ever could. The quiet strength that Marcus had exhibited wasn't just inspiring, it was life-changing. The ripple effect of that moment didn't just end with Emily. It reached far beyond the plane, touching not only those of us who had witnessed the events firsthand, but also those whose lives were indirectly influenced by it. People, it seemed, were waking up. The layers of assumptions that had clouded their perceptions began to peel away, one conversation, one thought at a time. I was sitting in a cafe a week later when I ran into Emily again. She was sitting alone at a table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and her eyes were focused on the notebook in front of her. At first, I didn't recognize her. She seemed different, more composed, more grounded. The frantic energy she had exuded that day on the plane had been replaced with a quiet reflection, a calmness that spoke volumes about the transformation that was taking place within her. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. But then she looked up and saw me, and a soft smile spread across her face. "Hey," she said, her voice warm but thoughtful. "I didn't expect to see you again." I smiled back, recognizing the change in her almost immediately. "I didn't expect to see you either," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course," she said, scooting her things aside to make room for me. As I sat down, I noticed that there was a slight tremor in her hands, but it wasn't one of nervousness. It was something deeper, a kind of quiet anticipation that I hadn't seen in her before. There was a different energy surrounding her, one that seemed to reflect an inner shift that had taken place. "How have you been?" I asked, curious to know more about what had been going through her mind since the flight. Emily took a deep breath before answering, her eyes drifting over to the window for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said slowly. I realized that I've been carrying assumptions around with me my whole life, things I didn't even know were there. About people, about what I thought they should be or where they belonged. And I wasn't even aware of it until what happened on that plane. She looked at me then, and I could see the sincerity in her gaze. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd judge someone like that. But I did. And the worst part is, I didn't even see it happening. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's so easy to fall into those patterns," I said quietly. "We don't realize how our assumptions shape our actions, but once you see it, it's hard to unsee it." "I know," she replied, her voice tinged with regret. "But I also realized that there's no use in feeling sorry for myself about it. What matters is what I do next, how I choose to approach people going forward." Her words struck a chord with me. Emily wasn't just reflecting on her past mistakes. She was acknowledging them and committing to do better. She wasn't wallowing in guilt. She was taking responsibility for her actions and using the experience as a stepping stone to become a better version of herself. It was a rare kind of self-awareness, the kind that's difficult to cultivate, but incredibly powerful when it takes root. "I can't change what I did," she continued, "but I can make sure I never make the same mistake again. I think what happened with Marcus taught me something important, that we don't always see the full picture. We make snap judgments based on what's in front of us, but that doesn't tell the whole story. There's so much more to a person than what meets the eye." I smiled at her, genuinely impressed by her perspective. "It sounds like you've learned a lot from this experience," I said. "I have," she said, her eyes shining with a newfound conviction. "And I owe a lot of it to Marcus. The way he handled the whole situation with such calm, it was inspiring. He didn't let me rattle him, didn't let me push him into a corner, and he didn't have to raise his voice or make a big show of it. He let me realize my mistake without making me feel like a failure." Her words reminded me of how Marcus had handled the situation with such quiet strength. It was easy to forget that his response had been intentional, that he had chosen to respond with grace instead of anger or frustration. He had understood that the situation wasn't just about him. It was about giving Emily, and everyone watching, a chance to learn. And in doing so, he had offered a valuable lesson in empathy, in forgiveness, and in the power of leading by example. "It's amazing," I said softly, "how one moment can change everything. How something so small can have such a big impact." Emily smiled at me, the weight of her reflection still lingering in her eyes. "I think that's the thing I've learned the most," she said. "One moment can change everything. And if we're open to it, if we really pay attention, we can learn something new every day. Every interaction has the potential to teach us something, even if we don't realize it at first." We sat in silence for a few moments, letting her words sink in. There was a sense of peace in the air between us now, a kind of quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. It was as though Emily had shed the last remnants of her old self, the one that had been quick to judge, and in its place, she had emerged as someone more self-aware, more open, and more compassionate. "I think you're going to do great things, Emily," I said, my voice full of warmth. "The fact that you're aware of what you've done and are committed to doing better, that's powerful. Not everyone can say that." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you. I hope I can live up to it." As we finished our coffee, I couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. Marcus's quiet lesson had spread far beyond that airplane, far beyond that one moment. It had triggered a transformation in Emily, and I had no doubt it would ripple out to others as well. It was the kind of change that wasn't just about one person learning a lesson. It was about a shift in perspective that could continue to grow, affecting the way we all saw the world and the people around us. As we stood up to leave, Emily turned to me with a new light in her eyes. "I don't know what's next," She said, "But I know one thing for sure. I'm going to keep learning, and I'm going to keep growing." I smiled at her. "And that's the best thing you can do." We parted ways, and as I walked away, I felt a quiet sense of hope that wasn't just for Emily, but for everyone she would encounter from here on out. The ripple effect of Marcus's grace had already begun, and it was spreading, touching lives in ways that no one could predict. One simple interaction had sparked a chain of change that would continue to echo far beyond the flight we all shared. And that was the real power of Marcus Williams' lesson. It wasn't just about the man in the suit or the flight attendant who had learned from her mistake. It was about how one moment of quiet strength, one act of humility, could start a wave of transformation that no one could stop.